Okay, folks, we're going to look at light tanks in Shadow Empire. This is going to be part of a series that I'm going to do on strategy and tactical considerations in Shadow Empire. And this is really an invitation to the community just to kind of get some debate about the game, because I feel that Shadow Empire's meta is still very much being discovered at the moment. And we need to come together and kind of try and figure out where it's at. I do see quite a lot of kind of claims made about Shadow Empire that don't always turn out to be true when you take into account some of the complexity that the game throws at you. So one of the big ones that I see, one of the big no-brainers that I see quite a lot, is this idea that light tanks are overpowered. So the topic of today's podcast, if you want to call it that, is light tanks. So what is it about light tanks that make them so attractive in the early game? They're an interesting model. They come out very, very early. It's high velocity guns is the tech, and it's in the basic tech level. So this is the tier of technology that you get immediate access to once the game starts, providing that you're starting the game on what I would call a standard game setup, where you're starting on, I think it's tech level 3, just the sort of default setting in the game, where you're starting out as kind of rudimentary and rustic as you possibly can. The light tank is, I'd say, very, very, very attractive, particularly if you're fighting in a map that has lots of open terrain. Now, I think this is where this kind of idea that it's a bit of a no-brainer early on comes from, because when I've questioned people about this, it usually turns out that they tend to play on things like Siwa class planets, or any kind of planets where you don't have that much mountain terrain. Okay, and I've seen some other YouTubers as well kind of warn people off from playing with large amounts of mountains. This is good advice, by the way, if you're new to Shadow Empire. However, Shadow Empire is really, really interesting, and some of the more extreme planet settings really do make the game more interesting. And the reason is because it kind of removes this idea of no-brainers a little bit. And again, I open this up to my audience and to people who are listening to this. Please let me know if you feel that there is a no-brainer that you think is absolutely, you have to do it every single time, no matter the planet, no matter the settings, no matter the terrain, no matter your neighbors. Yeah, I'd be interested to hear it, because I've yet to find one. I think I've kind of experimented with a lot of these things and trying to get my head around the sort of game meta and the tactica that you would use, right? Okay, so with the light tank, it does seem like a bit of a no-brainer, especially if you're in open terrain. It's very, very effective in open terrain, but it really does not do well if attacking into anything more than kind of like light forests, like savanna. If you've got forests, heavy forest jungle, cloud forest, mountains, attacking over rivers, any of these kind of things, the light tank and tanks in general really, really start to lose their effectiveness, particularly if they're attacking things like infantry. So again, where does this idea that this thing is, kind of a no-brainer come from? One of the things about the light tank is, although it is superseded by the medium tank relatively early on in a game, unless you're playing with reduced research levels, the light tank is kind of a bit of a ubiquitous thing, because you can give it two different types of guns. It can take a high velocity gun for killing armor, and you can also give it a howitzer. Now, I think that high velocity guns on light tanks don't really seem to be, I don't see many people talking about that, and I see people actively discouraging people from doing that. There are a few occasions, I think, where having a high velocity gun on a light tank model can be quite useful. One of those is if you are on a map where you've got lots of slavers, for example, which are an AI type, a minor regime type that use a lot of vehicles, and they'll use buggies and kind of improvised trucks and some kind of weak light tanks. And I think then high velocity guns can be quite effective. However, is it going to be effective enough that you are going to want to build your first light tank with a high velocity gun? I'll leave that up to you. I think if your immediate neighbors are slavers, and I'm sure we've all had those games where you start it up and immediately you've just got slavers on every side of you, then getting light tanks up with high velocity guns can actually be quite effective. I think most people seem to use them with the howitzer though, and a light tank can sport up to a 60mm howitzer. So what does this give you, particularly if we're talking about using it to take down infantry? I think the light tank is very, very effective against infantry up to a certain point. So technically, it will fight against anything up to combat armor with a really, really high effectiveness. So combat armor is 40mm thickness. So if you've got a 60mm howitzer gun, which is the maximum gun size that you can put onto a light tank, you're going to be 150% effective with the armor penetration, which is going to increase your soft attack against those soft targets. So any tanks attacking into something with combat armor is going to be, very, very effective. It's going to kill them quite easily. Unless there's the kind of unusual situation where they've got abnormally high hit points for some reason. Even then, I think the armor penetration is going to really make mincemeat of troops like that. Even against heavy combat armor with 60mm armor, they are 100% effective, okay? So you're not going to take any penalties. Battle dress is 80mm. You're going to get a 25% loss to effectiveness, to your hard attack, to your soft attack value. And against heavy battle dress, which is 100mm, you're actually losing 40%. So they're less effective against battle dress and heavy battle dress. And particularly when you include those increases, those incremental increases in hit points that you will get with battle dress and heavy battle dress, then the chances of a light tank model with a 60mm howitzer gun killing a unit with, a sub-unit with battle dress or heavy battle dress does decrease. However, they can do it. And I use them like this, fairly regularly. I think a lot of people would probably advise not to be using light tanks by that point of the game. There are other things that you can throw at, at large amounts of troops with battle dress, heavy battle dress, even heavy combat armor that might come across as being more effective. Particularly when those battle dress troops are sporting things like laser rifles, which will have a decent penetration against the 100mm maximum polymer armor that you're going to be able to put onto those light tanks. However, I argue that I think light tanks can remain effective right through the game. They are rivaled in the early game also by buggies. And buggies are really, I'm starting to learn this, they are really, really effective against infantry, especially low-level infantry in the early game. The issue with buggies is that they just don't have the gun, they don't have the size of guns that you can actually really lean into this kind of anti-infantry role. Okay, so you can get charged Gauss rifle machine guns on them, I think, and those are pretty effective. And you can also get laser machine guns on them as well, which can be pretty effective. However, all of those are costing things like rare metals, and they're going to be maybe even machinery. I forget now whether they cost machinery as well with the lasers. Either way, and also you're using energy. So there is a role for light tanks even into the late game, and I tend to have a few kicking around so that I can use them for attacking into infantry. There is a sort of window, I think, that they're still effective, and it will depend on the game, depending on the map. It will depend on whether you're playing single player or multiplayer as well, because I think players will be able to counter light tanks a little bit easier than the AI possibly can. They're going to be more aware of how to kind of defend against them. I think particularly though, light tanks do seem like an attractive option as your first model to go for these reasons. This is assuming that you are playing on these, regularly played planets like Siwa and other planets where you're not using lots of terrain. Anytime that you've got a planet with lots and lots of terrain, then infantry becomes king, and later on walkers are more effective, and you start having to think about using things like aircraft as well. So light tanks they are really, really effective, absolutely. They're not a no-brainer though, particularly if you are fighting in heavily wooded areas in mountains. They're just useless. They have like a negative 75% attack modifier into, I think it might be 80% or something if you're attacking into heavy forest. So they can be used in defense with less penalty, although bearing in mind that tanks also get a defense penalty against infantry, if I remember right. So those penalties are going to be stacking. So you're not only getting your 25% defense penalty for being in, you know, such terrain as forests, but you're also going to be using the tank's lower hit point value when they're being attacked by infantry too. So they're not particularly effective as a defensive unit, actually. Even if you're using them in, you know, in terrain, infantry can just swarm them so easily. They are somewhat better against defending against other tanks when they're in that kind of terrain, in difficult terrain. In that case, you want to be putting a high velocity gun on them or a laser gun. So I think that light tanks do have they do have a role. They can be, if you're fighting in planes, depending on the type of enemy that you're fighting against, they can be brutally effective. And I think this is where this kind of this sort of community idea that they are a bit of a no-brainer early on sort of comes from. I think, again, please correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm really, really intending this to kind of start a bit of a debate on the idea, on the topic of light tanks and just tanks in general, because I think that, yeah, they are very, very effective, but not to the point where I think, like, I've seen people talking about, you know, saying that they're so overpowered that it kind of makes the game unplayable. I just think that's rubbish. I think that Shadow Empire doesn't really have anything in it like that, to my experience. We'll get to things like micro nukes later, which I understand that there is a little bit of a contentious topic. I personally don't see the problem with those either, but I am less experienced with them as maybe some others, and I'm willing to be schooled on the topic. Returning to light tanks as well. Another use for them in the early game is that they are really, really good at killing buggies. And if you are playing a multiplayer game and you're coming across an opponent who's fielding lots of buggies, because buggies are a very cost-effective way of building a great infantry killing unit, light tanks with a high velocity gun will be pretty good at destroying buggies. Because if I remember right, I think a buggy can hold up to 50mm armor. And with a light tank, you know, you could put a 60mm high velocity gun on it, and then you've got a bonus. You're actually going to be fairly effective at killing those buggies, unless the buggies are very, very well designed. They've got loads of armor tech upgrades and that kind of thing. And usually, but at that point of the game, you're probably going to be, you know, by the time that the Applied Science Council comes out, and you're really pushing into these linear techs that make your buggies better, you're probably not going to be using buggies quite as much. And at that point of the game, things like medium tanks are going to start coming out. The light tanks get much more effective, that kind of thing. So there's a window, I think, for light tanks to be, you know, at their best game, but they don't by any means become completely obsolete by the end game. They might do on certain planet types, as we've discussed. And I think against you know, I think if you're playing in multiplayer particularly, you will eventually be going up against infantry that have got weapons that can deal, you know, a decent amount of damage against tanks. So I think in that case, you're going to have to change the role of light tanks to being, they're not going to be the frontline troop that are going to go up against heavy battle dress infantry wielding, you know, charged Gauss or laser rifles. At that point, they are going to be more like, you're going to be using them as a unit to get round and cut off supply, and then maybe attack, you know, for getting the opposing hex concentric bonus. That's another use for them. Bearing in mind also that light tanks can be quite fast. You can get a heavy diesel engine in the early game, and a heavy diesel engine will make them pretty rapid. So they are really, really useful for rapid deployment, and they work very well in tandem with armored transports as well. So the other AFVs that you've got in your army that support your infantry. Light tanks do tend to fall off when they are facing RPGs, and RPGs also come out quite early in the game. So RPGs tend to need a little bit of boosting. The first RPG that you get is not that good. When you start getting things like heavy RPGs and guided RPGs, they're gonna do pretty well against tanks, against light tank armor. It's only really when you start getting the 100mm polymer armor onto a light tank, which does start bringing their expense up in a big way, that you're going to be able to shrug off RPGs. Polymer armor is particularly effective. Polymer armor also gives light tanks a kind of new lease of life, I'd say. And when you start putting laser guns onto them as well, they do sort of change again. I'm a little bit less experienced with using them at that point of the game, when the tech tree has advanced to that point. So I'm going to turn it over to the comments section now. What do you think about light tanks? Do you think they're a no-brainer? Do you think they are a no-brainer on any terrain? Are they particularly useful on one kind of planet type? Do you think that they are something that you are still using in the late game? I've seen different comments on this. I've seen some people saying that they do find them quite useful. I've seen other people, and I'd say that the sort of general zeitgeist of where we're at with the meta of Shadow Empire at the moment is leaning towards this way, which is that light tanks kind of fall off, in the late game. They fall off in the mid game when they start coming up against bigger, more badass tanks like the medium tank and the heavy tank, and right up to the monitor tank, and then things like walkers. Light tanks particularly are going to die to walkers because walkers get such a huge bonus against tanks. I think that they can support such heavy weaponry. I think that light tanks really are going to struggle against those guys. Yeah, so let me know what you think in the comments. Let's get a bit of discussion going about this, because I'm genuinely interested to see what the community think about this. It's kind of the legendary overpowered model of Shadow Empire. Okay, guys, hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think about this format. I like doing podcast kind of stuff because it gives me a little bit of an opportunity just to talk. And I think when there's no distraction with video, it's really nice for people who are kind of just, listening to stuff at work. I've got a job, my second job, where I do manual work, and it's really, really nice to be able just to listen to people talking about the games that I like to listen to. So if you like this kind of thing, and if you want to hear more of this sort of thing from me, let me know in the comments, because I'm really, really interested. And yeah, let's get a conversation started. Okay, guys, catch you next time.